Please stop this!
The first thing that shattered was the glass display case, sending shards of sugar-dusted tarts across the floor like jagged diamonds. It didn't just break. It was pulverized by a rolling pin held by a man who believed that if he couldn't own something, it shouldn't exist. The glass cracked against the tile, sweet jam spreading across the floor like a sticky, red stain. Then a tray of cooling croissants followed, crushed under the heavy, indifferent weight of a boot. Then a row of delicate tiered cakes toppled one after another, their white frosting smeared into the dirt and debris. By the time John H. Fuller turned to survey his handiwork, the interior of Cheryl's confections looked like a battlefield. The air, which usually carried the warm, comforting scent of yeast and vanilla, was now heavy with the smell of ruined dough and the sharp, metallic tang of broken glass. And through all of it, Cheryl D. Smith said nothing. She stood behind the flour-dusted counter, her apron stained and her hair falling in messy strands across her face, watching him with an expression that wasn't just fear. It was a hollow, haunting silence that seemed to fill the wreckage of the room, a silence that usually signaled the end of something. John leaned over the counter, his face twisted with the kind of practiced malice that only comes from years of unchecked entitlement. "I told you, Cheryl," he hissed, his voice a jagged contrast to the quiet. "Nobody leaves me and keeps something this nice for themselves. You thought you were free? Look around. You're exactly where you started." He tossed the rolling pin onto the heap of ruined pastries, the wooden thud echoing like a final gavel strike. He pushed through the doorway without looking back, his gray hoodie disappearing into the afternoon light. John H. Fuller was a man who lived by the volume of his voice and the weight of his fists, a shadow Cheryl had spent years trying to outrun. He didn't build. He only knew how to take, leaving a trail of broken promises and bruised spirits in his wake. To him, Cheryl was just another asset to be reclaimed or ruined. He had no idea that his display of unchecked rage had just been witnessed. Standing in the shadows of the entrance, framed by the splintered doorframe, was a man who existed in a different kind of silence. William M. Hunter didn't move. He didn't shout. He simply watched, his expression as cold and controlled as the dark suit he wore. His presence was an anchor in the chaos, a sudden, heavy pressure that suggested the world John thought he controlled was about to shift beneath his feet. Before the first display case shattered, there was a silence in the bakery that Cheryl had spent 3 years perfecting. It was a silence built of flour, yeast, and the steady hum of the ovens, a peace she had bought with every penny of her savings and every ounce of her courage. She had chosen this specific corner of the city because the light hit the storefront just right in the mornings, and because the people here didn't ask questions about the faded bruise-colored shadows that sometimes lingered in a person's eyes long after the skin had healed. But the bell above the door didn't chime with its usual cheerful ring when the door swung open. It gave a frantic, strangled jingle, as if the brass itself recognized the hand on the handle. Cheryl didn't even have to look up from the sourdough she was scoring to know the air in the room had curdled. The temperature seemed to drop, replaced by a familiar, suffocating pressure she had felt in 1,000 nightmares. John H. Fuller didn't walk into a room so much as he invaded it. He stood in the center of the shop, his gray hoodie pulled low, his presence a jagged tear in the soft, powdered sugar atmosphere Cheryl had created. For a long moment, he just breathed, the sound heavy and rhythmic, a predator savoring the scent of a cornered thing. He looked at the hand-painted menus and the lace curtains, his lip curling in a sneer that dismissed everything she had built as a mere toy he allowed her to play with. "You've been hard to find, Cheryl," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that bypassed her ears and settled straight into the marrow of her bones. "Did you really think a new name and a coat of pastel paint would be enough? You belong to the life we had, not this charade. Cheryl's fingers tightened around the scoring knife, her knuckles turning as white as the flour on the counter. She had spent years looking over her shoulder, jumping at the sound of heavy footsteps on the sidewalk, and rehearsing the things she would say if this moment ever came. But now that the ghost was flesh and blood, standing amidst her cooling loaves, the words felt like dry ash in her mouth. She realized then that John didn't want the money he would eventually demand, nor did he want the bakery. He wanted the one thing she had fought so hard to reclaim, her fear. He moved toward the counter, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain, reclaiming the space she thought was hers alone. The transition from psychological intimidation to physical violence happened in a heartbeat, a sudden fracture in the air that smelled of ancient, unresolved resentment. John didn't wait for an answer he knew she couldn't give. He reached across the counter, his hand sweeping a display of hand-painted ceramic jars to the floor. The sound of them shattering was the starting gun for the storm. "You think you're better than me now?" John roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings and vibrating in the very floorboards Cheryl had polished until they shone. "With your fancy flower and your quiet life? You're nothing without the shadow I gave you." He grabbed a heavy wooden rolling pin from the marble prep station, a gift Cheryl's father had carved for her years ago, and brought it down with a sickening crack against the glass display case. The tempered pane didn't just break. It exploded, raining shards over the rows of raspberry tarts and lemon eclairs she had spent 4 hours decorating that morning. Cheryl didn't scream. She couldn't. Her boots felt as though they were nailed to the floor, her breath caught in a throat that had suddenly turned to stone. She watched, paralyzed, as her sanctuary was methodically dismantled. John moved with a practiced, rhythmic fury. He upended the cooling racks, sending 36 loaves of rosemary focaccia tumbling into the glass and debris on the floor. He gripped the edge of the antique hutch that held her grandmother's teacups, tilting it until the porcelain slid off and splintered into white dust. To John, this wasn't just property. It was the physical manifestation of Cheryl's hope, and he intended to leave none of it standing. The air grew thick with the scent of crushed herbs and the fine, white mist of flour he kicked up as he paced through the wreckage. He was a whirlwind of gray denim and raw, unchecked ego, looking for anything else to break. Cheryl stood behind the ruined counter, her hands pressed so hard against the wood that her fingernails left indentations. She wasn't watching the destruction anymore. She was watching him, her eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the monster she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Finally, the noise stopped, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of a man satisfied with his own cruelty. John stood amidst the ruins of Cheryl's confections, his chest heaving, a smear of white flour across his knuckles like a perverse victory marking. He looked at her one last time, a smirk of cold triumph on his lips, and turned toward the door. He didn't see the dark silhouette standing in the entryway, a shadow more substantial and far more dangerous than his own, waiting for the dust to settle. The bell above the door gave a final, mournful chime as John turned to leave, but he didn't make it to the sidewalk. He stopped abruptly, his boots crunching on a shard of what used to be a wedding cake topper. The doorway was no longer an exit. It was a frame for a silhouette that seemed to absorb the very light of the afternoon. William M. Hunter stood there, unmoving, his long charcoal coat draped over shoulders that held the weight of the city's unwritten laws. Behind him, 2 men loomed like twin monoliths, their hands folded in front of them with a terrifying, professional stillness. There was no shouting, no dramatic display of weapons, only a silence so absolute it made the previous destruction feel like a temper tantrum in the face of a god. John's bravado, a thin veil draped over a coward's heart, began to fray at the edges. He tried to puff out his chest, the rolling pin still clutched in his hand like a toddler's toy. "Get out of the way," he snapped, though his voice lacked the jagged edge it had possessed moments ago. It sounded thin, reedy against the heavy quiet of the man in the suit. William didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the rolling pin. His eyes, cold and slate gray, swept over the wreckage of the bakery. The ruined tarts, the bleeding jam, the white dusting of flour that coated everything like a winter of Cheryl's despair. Finally, his gaze settled on John. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the look of a man observing a stain that needed to be removed from a fine rug. "You've made a mess," William said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that carried the chilling weight of a death sentence. He stepped into the shop, his polished leather shoes navigating the debris with an eerie, predatory grace. He didn't look at Cheryl yet, but his presence seemed to shield her, a physical barrier rising between her and the ghost of her past. The bodyguards moved in unison, flanking the entrance, their expressions as unreadable as stone. The air in the bakery, once thick with John's frantic rage, was now pressurized by William's cold control. John took a half-step back, his heel catching on a crushed croissant. For the first time in years, the predator realized he was standing in the shadow of something much, much larger. Cheryl, still frozen behind the counter, felt the air return to her lungs, sharp and cold, as she watched the man in the doorway turn the room into a court where John H. Fuller was already found guilty. William Hunter didn't give a command, but the atmosphere in the bakery shifted as if a heavy curtain had been drawn. He looked at the rolling pin in John's hand, the same hand-carved wood that had once represented Cheryl's heritage and was now a weapon of her trauma. With a slight, almost imperceptible nod from William, the two monoliths behind him stepped forward. There was no shouting, no cinematic struggle. The enforcers moved with a terrifying, clinical efficiency that made John's earlier tantrum look like the flailing of a child. One man caught John's wrist in a grip that looked effortless but sent the rolling pin clattering into the flour-dusted debris. The other man stepped into John's personal space, his sheer bulk overmatching him so completely that John seemed to physically wither, his bravado evaporating into a cold sweat. "Wait, you don't understand. She's my—" John started, his voice cracking, but the excuse died in his throat as the first enforcer's fingers tightened. There was a dull, sickening pop of a joint being forced to its limit, and John's face went white. They didn't hit him. They simply dismantled his posture, folding him toward the floor with a series of pressure points and leverage that left him breathless and pinned against a ruined cooling rack. William stepped closer, his polished shoes stopping inches from where John's face was pressed against the tile. "You seem to be under the impression that this is a domestic dispute," William said, his voice a low, terrifying silk. "It isn't. You've damaged a sanctuary that was under my protection long before you decided to walk through that door. In my world, we don't fix things with apologies. We fix them with reparations." The enforcer behind John reached into the pocket of the gray hoodie and pulled out John's wallet, tossing it onto the counter near Cheryl's shaking hands. It was a symbolic gesture, a stripping of his identity before the real removal began. With a synchronized movement, the two men hauled John to his feet, his toes barely touching the ground. They didn't drag him. They escorted him toward the exit with a mechanical coldness that suggested he was no longer a person to them, but a piece of refuse being cleared from a construction site. As they reached the threshold, William spoke one last time, his back turned to the door. "If I see your shadow within 10 blocks of this street again, my men won't be this gentle. They won't use their hands next time." The door closed with a soft, final click. The frantic energy John had brought into the room was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavy and expensive. Cheryl remained behind the counter, her breath coming in ragged hitches, watching the man in the dark suit who had just rewritten the rules of her life without raising his voice once. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the bakery into a tomb-like quiet that felt both terrifying and sacred. The frantic, jagged energy John had brought into the room had been bled out, replaced by the weight of the man who remained. William Hunter didn't move toward the counter immediately. Instead, he stepped over a mangled cooling rack, his eyes tracking the white dust of flour that had settled on his expensive wool coat like fallen snow. He didn't seem to mind the stain. Cheryl's hands were still pressed against the wood of the counter, her knuckles aching from the tension. She watched him, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice finally breaking the silence. Why are you here?" William finally looked at her, and for the first time, the slate-gray coldness in his eyes softened into something resembling recognition. He walked toward a small, framed photograph that had survived the carnage, hanging crookedly on a side wall. It was an old, grainy shot of a man with flour on his brow and a smile that reached his eyes. Cheryl's father. "Your father was Elias Smith," William said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet reverence. He didn't wait for her to confirm it. 30 years ago, before I had the suit or the men or the name, I was a boy running from people much worse than your ex-husband. I didn't have a place to go, and I didn't have a reason to believe I'd see the next morning." He turned back to Cheryl, his shadow long and steady across the ruined floor. "I collapsed in the alleyway behind your father's first shop. He didn't call the police. He didn't ask who was chasing me. He just pulled me inside, hid me in the flour cellar, and fed me bread that was still warm from the oven. For 3 days, he stood between me and the world that wanted to break me." Cheryl felt a lump form in her throat, the memory of her father's quiet strength rushing back. She remembered the stories he'd tell about the importance of a warm loaf and a closed door, but she had never known about this. "Elias told me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he takes, but by what he protects," William continued, stepping closer to the counter. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over a shattered lemon eclair. "He saved my life when I was nothing. He gave me the only thing I ever had that resembled a home. And when he passed, I made it my business to ensure that the sanctuary he built for you remained standing." He looked around the wreckage, the broken glass, the wasted dough, the symbol of Cheryl's hard-won independence lying in pieces. John Fuller thought he was destroying a bakery. He didn't realize he was desecrating a debt that money can't pay. William reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal coat and withdrew a check, the paper crisp and white against the backdrop of the ruined bakery. He laid it on the flour-dusted wood of the counter, sliding it toward Cheryl with a steady hand. It was an amount that would not just repair the shop, but could buy 10 more like it. A life-changing sum that promised an end to the struggle she had endured since the day she left John. Cheryl looked down at the check, then back at the man who had just dismantled her past. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the scent of settling flour and the distant sound of city traffic. She felt the temptation of it, the ease, the safety, the sudden erasure of every debt she owed. But then her eyes drifted to the shattered glass and the crushed rosemary focaccia on the floor. "I can't take this," she said, her voice small but gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. She didn't reach for the paper. Instead, she tucked her shaking hands into the pockets of her stained apron. William's brow shifted almost imperceptibly. "Your father's shop is in pieces, Cheryl. This isn't charity. It is a restoration of what was stolen today." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's more than that. If I take this, if I let you simply pay for my life, then I haven't really won. I left John because I was tired of being a passenger in my own story. I was tired of things being given to me or taken from me at someone else's whim. She looked at the photograph of her father, the man who had worked 16-hour days with flour in his lungs to build a legacy. My father didn't hide you in that cellar because he wanted a payout 30 years later. He did it because it was the right thing to do. If I take this money, I'm putting a price on his kindness. I'm making it a transaction. William watched her, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of something, perhaps respect, darkened his slate-gray eyes. Most people in this city begged for his attention. No one turned away his gold. I spent 3 years saving every nickel for these ovens, Cheryl continued, her gaze sweeping over the wreckage. I scrubbed the grease off these walls until my fingernails bled. It's messy right now and it's broken, but it's mine. I need to be the one who puts it back together. I need to know that when the ovens turn on again, I'm the one who paid for the heat. She gently pushed the check back across the counter toward him. The paper moved through a thin layer of flour, leaving a clean trail behind it. Thank you for stopping him, she whispered. But please, let me earn my way back. William Hunter took the check back, his expression unreadable as he tucked the rejected fortune into his coat. He didn't argue, and he didn't offer a hollow platitude about her pride. He simply looked at the devastation of the shop once more before turning to the 2 men waiting at the door. If she wants to build, he said, his voice barely more than a murmur, ensure the city doesn't stand in her way. The next morning, the silence of the ruined bakery was broken not by Cheryl's solitary broom, but by the arrival of 3 black utility vans. Men in clean, professional coveralls stepped out, carrying industrial vacuums and specialized glass removal kits. When Cheryl tried to stop them, explaining she couldn't afford their services, the lead foreman merely touched the brim of his cap. Permit issues, ma'am, he said firmly. The city inspector flagged this site for immediate debris clearance to prevent public hazard. No charge to the owner. By noon, the bureaucratic nightmare that usually took months for a small business to navigate began to dissolve with supernatural speed. When Cheryl walked to City Hall to file for an emergency reconstruction permit, a process she knew would take weeks, she found the clerk already waiting with a stamped folder. The woman didn't look up from her desk, her face a mask of practiced indifference. Your application was expedited by the Commissioner's office, Ms. Smith. Zoning hurdles have been cleared. You're good to go. Every time a contractor quoted her a price that seemed suspiciously fair, or a supplier found a surplus of the exact Italian marble she had lost, Cheryl saw the invisible hand of the man in the dark suit. William wasn't giving her money. He was giving her a frictionless world. He was leaning on the scales of the city's power to ensure that for once, the small player didn't have to fight the system just to survive. One afternoon, a truck arrived with a new glass display case. Not a standard replacement, but a custom-built, reinforced unit with subtle steel framing. The manufacturer had an order cancellation, the delivery driver claimed, though the crate was marked with the seal of a high-end security firm. Cheryl stood on the sidewalk, watching the heavy glass being lowered into place. She knew the surplus and expedited permits were a different kind of currency, a silent protection that allowed her to keep her hands on the work while the monsters of the city were kept at bay. She was still the one painting the walls and kneading the dough, but the wind was finally at her back, guided by a man who knew exactly how to make a city listen. The morning of the grand reopening arrived not with a frantic rush, but with the steady, rhythmic calm of a woman who had reclaimed her own soul. Cheryl stood at the center of the shop, the early light catching the new, reinforced glass of the display cases and turning the polished marble counters into mirrors of gold. The air was thick and sweet once more, a heavy, intoxicating perfume of cinnamon, roasted yeast, and the sharp, bright scent of lemon zest. It was the smell of a life rebuilt, brick by brick, loaf by loaf. When she finally reached for the brass handle and propped the heavy oak door open, she didn't find the empty street she had feared. Instead, a line had already formed, stretching past the neighboring storefronts. There were regular customers who had missed their morning rituals, but there were also others, people she didn't recognize, men in quiet suits and neighbors from blocks away, who stood in a silent, respectful perimeter. It was as if the word had gone out through the city's hidden veins. This shop was no longer just a place of business. It was a sanctuary. As the first customers trickled in, the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. The bakery was more beautiful than it had ever been, the scars of John's rage replaced by a craftsmanship that felt timeless. The new display cases were filled with tiers of tarts that looked like jewels and loaves of bread so golden they seemed to glow under the soft pendant lights. Cheryl moved with a fluid, easy grace, her hands no longer shaking as she wrapped pastries in parchment and tied them with twine. She noticed a few large men standing near the entrance, their presence discreet but undeniable. They didn't buy anything. They simply stood, their eyes scanning the street with a professional, unwavering focus. They were the living walls William Hunter had built around her, a promise kept in the language of shadows. For the first time, Cheryl didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder. The ghost of her past had been exorcised by a power that understood the value of a sanctuary. By mid-afternoon, the bakery had become the heart of the neighborhood again, a warm pocket of light in a cold city. Children pressed their faces against the reinforced glass, and old couples sat at the small bistro tables, their quiet conversations mingling with the hum of the ovens. Cheryl looked out through the window at the city skyline, where William's influence resided, then back at her flour-dusted hands. She had earned this. She had painted these walls and kneaded this dough, and though a king had cleared the path, she was the one standing at the end of it. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden fingers through the reinforced glass of the bakery's storefront. The rush of the grand opening had finally tapered off into a comfortable hum, leaving the shop smelling of toasted oats and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. Cheryl was wiping down the marble counter, a familiar and meditative rhythm, when she looked up to see William Hunter standing by the display of tiered cakes. He wasn't accompanied by his usual wall of men. He stood alone, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat, looking at a small tray of almond biscotti. He didn't look like a man who moved the foundations of the city. He looked like a man visiting an old friend. "Your father used to say that the secret wasn't in the sugar," William said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "It was in the resting. He said you can't rush something that needs time to become what it's meant to be." Cheryl smiled, a genuine and weary expression of peace. He was right. I think I finally understand that. She walked around the counter, holding a small white box tied with a simple string. "I know you said the debt was his, but I wanted you to have these. They're the rosemary loaves. His recipe." William took the box with a nod of gratitude that felt more profound than any legal contract. He turned to leave, but stopped at the photograph of Elias Smith. He reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the frame. "People in my world believe that power is something you take," he murmured. "But your father taught me that true power is what you're willing to give away when you have nothing." As William stepped out into the twilight, Cheryl watched him through the window. She saw him pause on the sidewalk, looking up at the towering skyscrapers he owned, then back at the small, glowing sanctuary of her shop. The cycle that had begun in a dark alley 30 years ago had finally found its resolution. Loyalty, she realized, wasn't a transaction recorded in ledgers. It was a living thing that grew in the dark and bloomed when the season was right. John had tried to break her by destroying the physical walls of her life, But he hadn't understood that those walls were reinforced by a history he couldn't touch. As she turned off the lights, leaving only the warm glow of the oven pilots, Cheryl felt the weight of the past not as a burden, but as a foundation. Kindness had a longer memory than malice, and in the quiet of her rebuilt shop, she knew she was finally truly home.